So our essay title here is about inflation and how it's measured. So I'm expecting a definition of inflation. I want to know key things of the measurement. So key things might be the fact we've got a basket of goods, the fact that the weights in the basket of goods are determined by household spendings on the items, the fact that these are aggregated into an index number, and then the fact that inflation is calculated as percentage change in index number from one period to the next. We might then have a little bit on the RPI versus the CPI and what the differences are. And then finally, I guess we could have a little bit on the limitations of this approach to measuring inflation. Okay, first paragraph here is okay, there's nothing wrong, it sort of answers a question in miniature, and we'll have to see if the sort of things hinted at in here, like the basket of goods, etc., are developed in more detail later on. So this bit here is fine, it's got the CPI, it's talking about the basket of goods, it's talking about the weights in the basket of goods. Not sure about this bit, so each good or service is assigned a weight indicating how important it is to the average consumer, that's true, but by using the percentage of households on the survey using the good or service, I thought the weights came from sort of overall spending on the good or service, not just the percentage of households using it, so that might need a little bit of checking. Yeah, these bits are all okay, but they're quite reductive. I might actually have done an example, saying what the index was in 1 year, saying what the index was in the next year, and therefore what the percentage change in the index was. Okay, so this bit here goes on about the CPI and that different people have different inflation rates because they have different weights. So generally that's all correct. Some of the English isn't brilliant here. The CPI is the government's chief measure of inflation for the UK, full stop. Therefore it has its strengths of accuracy. Therefore it has its strengths is what you mean, I think. It is an accurate index. The strengths of accuracy just reads slightly strangely. As well as flexibility due to changing its list and weighting of goods and services regularly. Don't think we need the bit about the list. Changing its weighting of goods and services regularly would have done, full stop. But this is almost a full sentence. However, it is far from perfect because it only measures the inflation rate of a typical household, not each individual household. So this is all technically correct economics. The written English could be a little bit better in the first half of the paragraph, I think. Yeah, rewriting history a bit here. Due to the weakness of the CPI, the RPI is introduced. We were on the RPI for many, many decades, and then the CPI was the one that was introduced later, so that's sort of chronologically incorrect. Okay, so this bit's fine. We were talking about the RPI. We've got a little bit on how the RPI is different from the CPI. So overall, the first part, we have got all the things I mentioned at the start. We've defined inflation. We've got something on the basket of goods. We've got something on the weighting, although it might not be completely accurate. We've got something on moving from an index number to an inflation rate, but again, that could have been slightly better expressed. And we've got some limitations here in the sense that different households have different inflation rates. So that's doing pretty much what I want. If I was marking it with a mark scheme in front of me, I'd be ticking off individual points, and then most of the points will get ticked off and you'd get most of the 15 marks. If I was just making an overall qualitative judgment, how good an answer is that, that to me feels like an A grade answer, not an A star grade answer, just in terms of the quality of written expression. So let's just say therefore that that's going to be 12 or 13 out of 15, and then we look at the second part and come up with some overall feel for how good this essay is. Okay, so sensible start. We've defined inflation, we've defined deflation, instability is undesirable, that's all good. Ideal being stable prices below the government target of 2% inflation. Yeah, slightly clumsy. Does that mean that the ideal is stable prices, i.e. 0% inflation? Or does that mean that the ideal is stable inflation of 2%? It's just slightly clumsily expressed. I think the real answer is the government wants inflation between 0% and 2%. This bit's not bad because you have sort of summarised your main argument, and then presumably we go on to explore it in more depth. I've written a sheet on how to do essays, and one of the things it says is you can start with your definitions and then summarise your main argument. So in a sense we've done both of those things there, although probably might be an idea to split the two so that that opening paragraph actually is two separate paragraphs. Yeah, this bit up here is a bit worrying. We've got high inflation. Okay, well, high inflation, what would happen first is exports would fall, and because exports fell, that may then lead to the pound depreciating. But the way this is presented isn't right, because it's saying high inflation leads to depreciation, depreciation leads to more exports. So, starting from beginning to end, I've got high inflation leads to more exports. But that's not right, is it? Because high inflation means British exports are unattractive, even though the pound then may depreciate because nobody wants our pounds to buy our exports. It's not the case that overall exports are going to increase because of high inflation. So this bit is not really technically correct. Yeah, hard to follow. It's sort of saying high inflation leads to AD falling via a sort of tortuous mechanism here. Really, usually, high inflation comes from AD rising. So I'd have expected this diagram to say, this is AD1 and this is AD2. If demand moves outwards, we've got demand pull inflation. So it's bad because prices have gone up, but it's good because real national output's gone up and employment's gone up. So this one's just a bit odd because we seem to have high inflation and we seem to have AD going down. So I think we've lost the thread of things in the argument there a little bit. Okay, again, okay, but it's sort of inflation. We go through several steps in the argument, and we've got inflation causes inflation. Again, not quite how I'd have presented it. You need to stay on one bit, the obvious mainstream bit, and follow that through. Okay, this bit's better. Inflation can cause problems, and that inflationary policies depress demand, and depressed demand can have negative consequences. So that's a little bit of evaluation. But obviously what I'd have expected, as I said, is this bit up here is arguing that inflation comes with raised demand, and there are pluses and minuses to that, but this bit would then be arguing that the inflation controlling measures would reduce AD, and although that's got the advantage of lower inflation, it's got other disadvantages. So this bit's fine, but the sort of precursor bit up here isn't so good. Okay, classic example against deflation. It's associated with falling growth, falling employment, bad for the economy. That's why the government's inflation target is 2%, not 0%, because it's very worried about the possibility of getting into deflation. Yeah, again, this argument sort of puts the cart before the horse and gets muddled. Deflation will mean the currency appreciates. Right, deflation will mean exports go up. If exports go up a lot, then the currency might go up a little bit, and that would offset the increase in exports, but overall exports would still go up. The trouble here is you're arguing that deflation would lead to the domestic economy losing competitiveness. Now obviously that can't be right. If your goods get cheaper, overall your competitiveness has gone up. An exchange rate effect might then ameliorate that or lessen the increase in your competitiveness. But overall, deflation must have led to an increase in competitiveness. God, I can't say it. Too many T's in the middle. Okay, the bit that is true is that deflation will lead to a negative multiplier effect. Okay, so monetary policies could counter deflation here. Very interesting. There's a very famous bit of economics called the liquidity trap, and it says, when interest rates get really low, or people have really lost confidence, they won't borrow anymore, even if you cut interest rates further. Therefore, monetary policy can't get you out of a deflationary spiral. This is, thought to have been the case in Japan in the last couple of decades, and therefore, they've tried to adopt other policies to get out of deflation. So that one's worth thinking about. Okay, missing an apostrophe here. Government's revenue, it's possessive, so government apostrophe S. Okay, so not fantastic overall. I mean, basically, there's some truth in the conclusion. So inflation is bad because prices have gone up, but it's associated with rising AD, it's associated with growth, it's associated with falling unemployment, so it has some benefits. Deflation, there's a mixed picture. There are two types. Well, I guess inflation and deflation, there are two types. So the sort of inflation I've just described that comes from increases in AD, demand pull inflation, can be good. Obviously, costs push inflation. So, say we had an oil price shock as in 1973, is generally bad. There wouldn't be any real gain to AS shifting leftwards. We'd have higher prices and reduced output. So, if you like, we've got good and bad inflation. Similarly, we've got good and bad deflation. So, deflation could come from falling AD. That would be bad. Or it could come from rising AS. Rising AS would be good because it would mean real national output would be higher, employment would be higher, but the price level would be lower. So I guess, both inflation and deflation have good and bad types, although I think it's still true that the government probably would prefer mild inflation to mild deflation, and that's why the government target is set at 2% rather than 0%. Overall, Part B, I don't think it's quite right. There's some technical errors there in terms of the effects on trade. So the level 4 sort of mark, 17 to 21. We're almost struggling to get there a little bit because it's not quite accurate enough. So I might be saying 16. We said about 13 for the first part. It's 29 out of 40. That's about 73. That's an okay essay. It's not a world-beating essay. You want to read a better one, maybe watch the other videos.